Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll just give a brief introduction. My name is Michelle. I am the event coordinator for the Savannah Institute, and I'm just going to share some housekeeping guidelines for tonight and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is really exciting. All right. So like I said, thank you. Steve is going to be giving a presentation tonight on Silvopasture. And at the end of the presentation, it'll probably last 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for some question and answers at the end. To do that, you can either unmute yourselves for more of a discussion and interactive experience, or if you feel more comfortable, just go ahead and write your question in the group chat area, and I'll read them off, and we can just go about it that way. Something fun that I've been doing in the beginning of each of these is asking people where they're tuning in from, because we're getting people all the way from the United Kingdom, which is really great. So we want to go ahead and then that also just gets us exercising the group chat. And then I will mute myself and just let Steve take it away.
Okay. Hello, everybody. We have a nice group of folks. We're doing an online Silvopasture course for the next 6 weeks, and so I know some of the folks in the room here are popped in from that. So a few of the first slides might be redundant because we just started our course. Let me just share my screen. Okay. There we go. All right. Awesome. So yeah, feel free to pop questions in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. And then we definitely have some time to chat at the end about, I was asked this to talk specifically about food safety. And if there's any auxiliary questions, I'm sure we're able to get into those as well. And I'm actually really grateful that I was asked to talk about this, and there's been a great dialogue with the Savannah Institute folks and Farm Commons, which we'll talk about, and just sort of trying to understand some of the aspects of this. This is one of these things that, as I researched the Silvopasture book, popped up as like a very interesting little nuanced corner, and something that I think collectively we could all work together to improve in terms of understanding interactions specifically between grazing animals and tree crops that we want to harvest food from. And so that's something I'm really curious about, and found, along with a lot of other things in researching for the Silvopasture book, was like there was enough information to get started, maybe enough information to be a little dangerous, but definitely a lot of room to grow and understand. And so we have work to do in this part of Silvopasture. Just a little bit about me. My wife Elizabeth and I are blessed to steward about 50 acres of mixed forest and pasture in the Finger Lakes region of central New York. Wonderful place on earth that's still a bit tucked away, but right in the center of New York State, essentially. And our farm is right in between Lakes Cayuga and Lake Seneca, which are two of the largest of the Finger Lakes. And my journey began in being interested in forestry and forest ecology, getting a bit sort of disillusioned with the way forestry was singly focused on timber. And so then getting more into ecology and understanding, but not quite wanting to just do wildlife, and really feeling this weird tension in conservation work between, you know, humans and the environment, that I feel like is a fallacy that we need to continue to challenge, because humans are needed in the environment. We just need to do a lot better job of stewarding, taking care of it, as have many, many people for many, many centuries. It's really been relatively recent that our general approach has been to sort of trash the land that we have access to. And so I think we have great potential to do that, but we have a lot of learning in that curve to get there. So Wellspring Forest Farm was something that my wife and I started in 2011 after both of us working for about a decade in other farming sectors and enterprises. And I did some tree work and creek restoration work and all sorts of fun stuff. The books came about really, my passion has always been as a writer and seeing a need for helping to pull some of these agroforestry concepts forward and hopefully explain what we know about them, what we don't know, and how folks can get started. And that was really the goal. So it's been a wonderful experience for me to have that opportunity to write and to share the experiences of a lot of other people. Both these books were written by many people in the sense that they're hopefully the stories of many researchers, many farmers, many experiences around the world. So our farm is a small diversified farm. We're both working off farm part-time, and so the farm's been always an interesting child of ours, and now we have a child. So there's a new dynamic that we're working on, and I was mentioning in the last class, we sort of are always shifting our goals and our abilities, and the land is always changing and the markets are always changing, and this year just felt like all those things. We had a dry drought year, our markets shifted to almost entirely direct market outlets, and then our family dynamic changed in a beautiful way. And so yeah, so it's been a really abundant year too. And so our farm has picked and narrowed down a list of crops that work well because they require different types of energy. They require energy at different types of the year, and they fit with our goals and what the land can benefit from, as well as what we like to do. So I love working with mushrooms, and that's a good complement to something like grazing. Mushrooms are grown in very small spaces and very detail oriented, and grazing is much more broad and expansive, and so it works well for us in the time being. And really important to us and to our work is to understand and grapple with and wrestle with the fact that we are farming or occupying land that is indigenous, that has an indigenous story. All land has an indigenous story, and too often that story has been ignored, shoved aside, often, in most cases, violently. And so the destruction that was wrought on the land is also something that was wrought on people. And we come from the lands of the Goyimkono. That's the Cayuga name for Cayuga, which is one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee people, which are mostly those who have traditionally been in what we call New York State now, and also parts of Canada. And so we're fortunate that we're able to learn, to build relationship, to support the work of the Goyimkono. We donate portions of our farm sales to seed and language restoration work that those folks are working on. And we grapple with just sort of the complex and really tragic history that's embedded in the landscape as one of the stories that we're working to restore alongside of all the things that happen. So I encourage you, wherever you are, if you don't know the names and customs and history of the people whose land you're on, to learn that and to think about how that fits into the story of farming and agriculture in your community. Our farm is centered around one idea, which is to farm in the image of a forest. And we use agroforestry as a tool and we use silvopasture as one of the ways that we try to support that goal. And so when we walk off the land, or hopefully are buried on the land someday, we hope that there's a forest in our footsteps, a healthy, robust forest that supports productivity for humans and also for wildlife at the same time. And that's really our orienting principle that we try to keep coming back to when we're not sure what the heck we're doing farming. And so what we're going to focus on tonight is like this one little sliver of, to me, what's a very big picture, but a really important piece. And so where we're going to start with food safety is, well, why would we want to mix animals with our food anyway, with crops and cropping systems? And this is a chart that was from the Silvopasture book, looking at some of the different species that most commonly these are certainly not all the species that folks intergraze with crops, but some of the most common ones, and sort of the skill sets they bring. It's like each of these has their own unique set of tools, unique set of the way that they work the land, and each one of these can do incredible benefit to the land and also do incredible damage to the land. And so our job, often I think of ourselves more as like an orchestra conductor or something, is to put the right animal in the right place at the right time, and we can have some of those benefits realized. And if we don't do that, often we get the reverse result. And so often people are bringing in animals for things like vegetation management, whether that's maintenance like mowing or clearing or tilling, right? And then there's also the kind of slug, bug, disease pressure, and then there's fertility. All these animals bring fertility to sites as we do. And so we think about this in that context, and then the challenge is, well, what are all the little nuances, all the little nitpicky details of doing this and having the right animal at the right place at the right time? And that's really the challenge that we're faced with. And it's certainly nothing new. So this is one of the oldest sort of, let's see, how should I say it? The oldest sort of documented agroforestry and silvopasture has a very long history, indigenous, traditional, not necessarily documented, something we can pull up in a library, but here's a very old 14th century French painting depicting the practice of pannage, which is where pigs were brought in by essentially the serfs or the sort of peasant farmers on the feudal lands to clean up the nut harvest when it was available. This came in at a certain time when the nuts were abundant and when they were on the ground. And it was coupled with a variety of activities. It didn't necessarily happen the same way every year. It definitely didn't happen continuously throughout the year, right? So that's like one little snippet of something that we can take with us. The dehesa, which is a system in parts of Spain and sometimes called the montado in parts of Portugal, is a very old silvopasture type system, which has oak species as its kind of keystone tree, mixed with pasture, and again, pigs often showing up. And sheep were actually a very important part and continue to be a very important part of what's left of these systems, which are over 400 or 500 years old. But again, very targeted, brought in at very specific times. And in these systems, mostly the food was actually for the animals. That was the design of the system. And if you're familiar with a book called Tree Crops, a very famous sort of book that inspired a lot of folks into agroforestry, J. Russell Smith, a lot of his focus is, well, you grow these things for the animals. You don't actually grow them for human consumption, because that's the easiest way to harvest them, is just to run the animals through. So we have kind of some of that peppered in here, but certainly we have some history where animals also show up as part of a system that's more for human consumption as well. So lots of historical reference in Europe and other parts of the world to orchard grazing. Ag Forward in the EU is a really great resource generally for agroforestry, but they have a grazed orchard research paper that summarizes some of the impacts and benefits of grazing in established orchards. And so of course we can imagine, I mean, this is a beautiful picture in and of itself, nice time of year. The trees are mature enough so we don't have to worry about the animals stripping the bark or consuming the vegetation. So we can imagine a scenario where this is a very idyllic situation. The likelihood of us working with this is probably pretty low. We're probably working with smaller trees, more about establishing orchards, and so there's an inherent challenge there. And there's also, of course, no matter what the age of your orchard, the challenge of, well, when it comes time to harvest the fruit, what are we going to do, and how are we going to work with the animal interaction? So kind of one big picture piece I like to put to most folks when we're talking about silvopasture is often people gravitate immediately for when they think about silvopasture to producing crop producing tree, like a nut tree or a fruit tree. And so I like to pose the question and get people to think about, well, what are you actually seeking in a silvopasture system? There's very few silvopasture systems that are both a large productive livestock enterprise and a significant productive tree crop enterprise at the same time. You can have both of them, but if there's not a lot of examples historically or currently where those two systems are sort of both occupying the same level of intensity, if that makes sense. So for instance, if I have an orchard, I might bring animals in to do the maintenance, but I don't need the same number of animals as if I was going to run a poultry enterprise where I'm trying to sell broilers or something like that, right? So the volume of animals doesn't necessarily match what we're trying to do. So I encourage people to start thinking, and I'll provide some examples of that, but are you looking to focus your enterprise around like a tree crop system? And the animals are basically like there to help with this ecosystem support services, which means you basically need less animals than you might need if your actual focus is on the livestock system, where the trees are there to hopefully support the livestock's health and well-being over time, right? And it doesn't mean you can't have both these things, but as far as a reality check goes, it's pretty hard to achieve both at the exact same time. And so I see folks kind of recognizing they're actually interested in centering one of these and then kind of building the other around it, if that makes sense. And so take it or leave it if that's useful, but that's something I've observed and experienced in a lot of different cases. So for us is a very kind of obscure example of this, I would say, compared to what we think of as like sheep grazing in orchards is very common. But here we are with our mushrooms. We did a couple-year research project where we worked with ducks in the woods, and we were looking to reduce or eliminate the slug pressure on our beautiful mushrooms that were growing in the woods. And so in our mind's eye, we were like, oh, we'll just put the ducks in with the mushrooms and it'll be easy, right? And the simple answer is no, that wasn't the case at all. There's a lot of nuance to the timing and density and configuration of the two in this system to make it work, both from a productive standpoint, a management standpoint, also from a safety standpoint. There's a big issue here of leaving a bunch of ducks in the woods. It's degrading to the forest ecosystem. I'm going to walk through here and harvest these mushrooms. I'm going to get poop all over my shoes, and there's a good chance I could transfer that to the mushrooms. And mushrooms don't get washed. They're a crop that are cleaned but not washed, because washing them tends to do damage. So there's an inherent challenge there. This is an example where if we were focused on a mushroom enterprise, I would probably need about a third to a quarter of the number of ducks you see in this picture in order to maintain low slug counts in here, all right? We were trying to simultaneously produce mushrooms and raise meat ducks, and that was where the challenge hit, and where that kind of last point where the rubber hits the road. It's hard to raise hundreds of ducks and get the pest control because there's just too many ducks to put in the mushroom yard. It doesn't quite match up. So just keep that in mind as you go. And if you're interested in kind of that specific use of, we learned a lot from that project, and we got funded through Northeast SARE. We finalized that project. We actually looked at also using ducks to reduce slugs in pasture for our sheep, because a lot of parasites are transmitted from slugs. And so those, we turned into a couple guidebooks, the final reports, and those are available on our website. I'll put the link in the chat. I didn't put it on this slide. It's just media.wellspringforestfarm.com. And the duck guide was just because we learned a lot about raising ducks that we couldn't find in written form. So if you're thinking about raising ducks, you might find some interesting info in there. So for us with the sheep, just as an example, like we're mainly doing a livestock enterprise. We're not trying to do, we have one small orchard on our farm for home use and sharing and trading. But by and large, we use species like willow, poplar, and black locust, because rather than managing intensively a tree crop, which takes a lot of extra management, we're more interested in the shade, shelter, and fodder and medicinal benefits those trees offer. And so why choose a tree like fruit and nut trees are great, but they require a lot more maintenance and care and cost. But if my interest is in these things, I would go with these fast growing, much more grazing adapted and sort of tolerant species, right? So that's where your goals are going to really orient, I think, the type of system you might think about doing. Here's a system just down the road from us. It's the Good Life Farm. Think of like Cider House, where they center their enterprise around an orchard system. And so they have their peach trees and their apple trees here, and they use turkeys and geese as somewhat of a mowing strategy, and also a pest reduction strategy, and a fertility strategy. So when they first started, they were actually doing some pretty complicated calculations to look at the feed input, the grain input in their turkey enterprise. Was that essentially enough to match the fertility needs of their orchard trees? Because it's just the turkeys are just a filter for the grain onto the crop. And it wasn't quite enough, but it was interesting to think about it in that way and think about fertility as a function. The animals are doing that work on a daily basis. How does that feed into that system, right? But their enterprise is ultimately centered around the orchard. And so they had to think about scaling the birds to a certain amount to accommodate that. And In the early years, they were doing asparagus. They're still growing asparagus, but they used the animals specifically for some of the pest problems. And one of the wonderful things about asparagus is it's one of those crops that's one of the first to harvest of the season. So rotating animals through and having them poop all over the place is not really a food safety issue, because they would just wait till that first harvest, those first harvests had passed, and they're mostly interested in fertility and pest control when the plant was going through its fruiting and flowering phase, and setting up its roots for the next seasons, right? So spring fruiting crops are actually really great from a food safety perspective, because you can graze throughout the season. One of the challenges of those fall harvesting crops is, how do we get the animals in and out and still think about food safety when it comes time to harvest? Probably one of the oldest examples in the U.S. would be down in the South. There's some historical sort of pecan orchards, and cattle were often grazed underneath. And this is a combination system that at scale does work. There are significant areas where you could raise your beef and have your pecans, and the cows would just be moved out, before, but they would help keep the vegetation down. There's been some interesting research about fertility cycling, and it's certainly a cool system that exists. So some good mutual benefits there from an income standpoint as well for the farmer. So why do we have to think about food safety? It's not the thing that I got into farming for. I imagine most people have not chosen that as the reason they're farming. But one reason is because we're required to. Certain producers at certain scales are generally required to follow certain regulations. And so that's a piece, but there's not actually a significant enforcement side to a lot of regulations. And so I think actually the bigger concern with a lot of food safety stuff is the potential for an incident to happen and for customers to get sick and then it to come back to you. And I think it's more about a market concern actually in the long term, and a sort of reputation in the community concern. So regulations and food safety guidelines can offer good guidelines for best practices that ultimately lead to happy customers. And I think that's the most important aspect to this. It's not, we don't want to operate in the food safety realm out of fear of being caught. It's more about knowing how to proceed in a way that's going to work and produce a healthy product here. So that's kind of the frame I want to propose this propose this sort of conversation from around food safety is something that benefits us. And I like this quote from Farm Commons. Farm Commons, if you're not familiar, they are, I was recently working with Richard. I don't know if Richard made it onto the call, but during the question answer, yeah, Rich, you're there, cool. I could maybe put you on the spot to just share a little bit about the research. He's been talking to producers who do commingle livestock and tree crops to learn more about the nuances to help create a guide for folks when they're thinking about these. And it's really great work. And Farm Commons, that's kind of a good summary of a lot of great work that Farm Commons does to interpret this really kind of frustrating and convoluted and confusing world of regulations. And if you bumped up against it, regulators are not great at explaining themselves generally. Sorry if there's any regulators in here. Maybe you are good at it, but a lot of the ones I work with in New York, it's sort of like speaking two languages sometimes, and farmers can get really frustrated. So in my day job with the Cornell Small Farms program, we get a lot of farmers coming to us saying, I don't understand why this is this way or why this is this way. And frankly, it's not actually a regulator's job to interpret. They're just supposed to sort of enforce or sort of create some structure around them. It's up to legislators to make these things. So there's kind of this complicated bouncy house situation going on with regulations, right? So Farm Commons is great because they help interpret and explain risk to farmers. And I think the best advice I ever got was from Farm Commons, which is you just know what rules you might break if you're going to break them, and make decisions about risk and reward assessment around these different things. So their goal is to help sort of, I think, lift some of the confusion, help explain things, and help you understand. It's sort of like jaywalking. Like there's a lot of laws out there that we're probably going to break. We just need to understand the nuances and then make good decisions as farmers. And that's sort of the best we can do. If you don't have to adhere to standards, this is another important point that this quote makes. There still could be a food safety incident and you still could be liable for that. And often courts will turn to the highest standard, which is what's written in a code or a law or a regulation, as the standard to fall back on. And so you may actually be accountable to that, even if you're technically exempt from it. So it's good to know what you're getting into, right? So with what we call FSMA, FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, this was passed back in the Obama years. I think it was 2008. Someone can correct me in the chat. Maybe they know the timeline of this a little more. But really interesting process, I'd say, because FDA put out a lot of call for comments, and farmers really commented, and they actually adopted quite a bit. Not enough, but a good amount. And specifically when we talk about mixing grazing livestock and tree crops, I think they did a remarkable job at hearing farmers and providing a guideline that is flexible, which is not a common thing in regulations. So we're not going to walk through this whole chart, but there are, if you Google FSMA decision tree, you can kind of walk yourself through this. A couple important points here. Let me try to draw on this, if I can remember how to do that. I could probably just do this. One thing is, if you sell less than $25,000 per year of produce that you're including in the theoretical system here we're talking about, you're probably exempt from having to adhere to the produce safety rules specifically of the Food Safety Modernization Act. Okay, so that's one thing right away. If you sell more than $25,000 a year, you might be qualified exempt, which means qualified exempt means you sell less than $500,000 in food sales, and that at least the majority of those are going to a qualified end user, which essentially means you're selling them locally, direct, and retail. You can see down here in the subnotes, it says consumer to farmer's market, CSA, restaurant, retail food establishment. Okay, so if you're selling your stuff there, you might be okay. You may not actually have to follow the produce safety rules. Your markets, though, may require you to, excuse me, follow them, regardless of if the government does. So on some level, we have a really nice support here for small farms. Most farms in the US are under $500,000 in annual sales. And if they're selling to local markets, they're not as held to the same high standards as some of the larger producers. So that's a pretty impressive, I think, aspect to this flow chart here and this sort of process. So what we're looking at here is a federal, again, the FDA, Food Safety Modernization Act, produce safety standards, okay? Very similar, and in most states, same as the GAP standards, which are good agricultural practices, which is another set of voluntary standards that producers often are entering when they enter wholesale markets and larger markets like institutions and things like that, okay? So if you're mostly thinking of sticking small, local, and more or less direct, you're often kind of falling off the radar of these things. And if you're a much smaller producer, you're really off the radar. So that's one piece of, whew, okay, good news if you fall into that camp, which a lot of folks do. Let me go to the next slide, but I need to have this annotation. Okay, oh, let's clear that stuff out of here. Okay. So what about organic is another question. So organic, just like a GAP certification, good agricultural practices, is voluntary. This is something that producers choose to do versus we could say the FSMA, the FDA, which you are required to do if you meet a certain threshold like we just went over. So organic, voluntary, might be worthwhile for your markets. One question in there that is continuously coming up around grazing animals and food safety is, what about the rules around raw animal manure application? So the way the National Organic Standards read is on the slide here. You either need to compost the raw manure. If you apply it raw, then it needs to be used on a crop that's not going directly for human use, or it needs to be not less than 120 days prior to the harvest of a product whose edible portion has direct contact with soil, or not less than 90 days of a product whose edible portion does not have direct contact with the soil. All right, so those are kind of the standards in there. Now the question really is raw manure application considered grazing? And What we found over time, and I'd love for folks to chime in if they have different experiences, is it depends on your certifier. So whoever's certifying you. In New York, we have folks that use NOFA, that use Pennsylvania Certified Organic, and probably some other ones. But it kind of depends on the interpretation, because again, a lot of these regulations depend on the interpretation. So this is meant for, I think, my interpretation is, if you read into it, it's really meant for literally like cleaning, mucking, or harvesting manure and then applying it to the field. It is not the same as properly done rotational grazing. So I don't feel like this applies. And one of the problems with this, of course, is if we follow this rule, it's really hard to have a grazing plan in an orchard, let's say, where you have a product who might fall on the ground like nuts or something, and you don't graze it for 120 days. Well, that's pretty much your growing season, if not more than your growing season in many parts of the temperate climate, at least. So so it doesn't work for folks. So there's some questions there, and you have to, if you're in organic programs, you need to talk to your certifier about how they interpret the raw animal manure standard as part of this. All right. Fun. Next, let's go back to FSMA. Okay. So I call this FSMA and the shocking use of common sense, because all these things to say, we have this FSMA piece. You may be exempt, you may not be exempt, but even if you're exempt, we've already established from our discussion around farm commons statement and things like that, that it's a good idea to follow these guidelines, right? It's a good idea to have a plan if you're gonna mix grazing livestock and tree crops. I think that's the take home message. So let's get into what people say, because we should make sure the way we operate our farms is connected to what is out there in the written word, right? So here's what FSMA finally ruled in the produce safety. It says, at a minimum, all farms should visually examine the growing area and all covered produce to be harvested, regardless of the method used. That seems pretty reasonable. Second, under certain circumstances, you should do additional assessment during the growing season. If you find significant evidence of potential contamination, you might want to take the measures reasonably necessary to support you later during harvest. Okay, that seems reasonable as well. And so the third point is that the final rule does not actually require a waiting period between grazing and harvest, but they encourage farmers to voluntarily consider applying an interval as appropriate for your farm's commodities and practices. That's amazing. I've never seen any regulation written like that. And when I found this and dug into it for the Silvopasture book, I was like, wow, somebody was in a good mood and really took farmers' comments to heart, because what this really says is that it depends. And so we can't say, and if you dig into the writing, they say there's really not good established research that there's a specific interval between when an animal is next to a tree that produces a crop and when they're gone, and how safe it is. And so we just don't know. So we need farmers to exercise common sense. Let's put it in their hands. Let's give them that power, and that's amazing. So we're really lucky, whether you have to conform or not, to know that. It doesn't mean we don't do anything, but it means that we have that leeway to work with something, okay? So then the next question for me was, what does the research say? So I just pulled up a couple of these things. There's a bunch more out there. Again, I should have put "it depends" very large across the screen, because it really, really does. All these papers and articles cite things like weather, the season, the density of the animals, the duration of the animals, the type of animal, the type of crop, the type of soil. I mean, it's literally every piece depends on the system, right? So we're not going to be able to, you cannot research, I bet you probably can't research and find a paper that's going to say, this is the answer for your farm and your situation. But here's a couple nuggets here to think about. So this was an interesting article, and you can follow this link and actually access it. So they were looking at specifically leafy green vegetables and leafy green products. The reason I focused on this one is because they're very susceptible to bacterial contamination and pathogens, and so there's a lot of extra concern put towards that. In this case, they were not grazing animals within those systems. They were looking more at the relationship and how close or far the animals might be in proximity to those fields, and if there was any issues. So they were looking at aerial drift and also soil effects and that sort of thing. And they basically found nothing. And they didn't find anything in the fields that the sheep were actually grazing in this case. So that's another important thing, is that it's not just about the leafy crops over there, it's actually the fields the sheep were grazing in. Their manure did not have a prevalence of pathogens that we might be concerned about with food. The California Leafy Green Products guidelines still encourage 30 feet of buffer between grazing lands and leafy crops, which is pretty small actually for a crop that's that vulnerable to things. Okay, so those things are more likely to be contaminated probably from issues with washing and the water in the manufacturing and handling process than from a grazing animal nearby, which I think is pretty cool. All right, this other one is about specifically using pigs in this case for managing orchards, inorganic apple orchards. And they found the pigs helped at the right time and the right density and all those things. They did not find a lot of bacterial presence during different periods they were taking that, and nothing really on the leaf or apple samples. The apple samples is from the tree itself. I don't know if it was drops also, but just not a huge presence of these pigs, and nothing really residual there to be concerned about. Now, please don't take these two things and cite them and say, it's all good, I don't have to worry about it because of these two papers. These are just two examples that teach us a few things, and the other research that's out there could teach us more things about this. But as I mentioned at the top of the talk, I think there's a lot more we could dig into around this question and around some of the specifics. So if you're part of a cider makers group, or you're specifically part of a group that works with pigs in these situations, perhaps a collective action is to apply for a SARE grant or another source of funding, maybe through Savannah Institute or Practical Farmers of Iowa or something like that, to support you to do that research, to understand best practices around your system, right? And glean some of the lessons learned from this, but don't use them as the way to justify how you go about it. So we might summarize best practices when we think about these regulations. So we want to think really intentionally about who's doing the work and the workflow around grazing and around harvesting, right? And then what tools and equipment are also going to be interacting. So we're mostly thinking about things like fresh manure on the ground, someone walking through the orchard with a ladder and stepping in it, stepping up on the ladder, harvesting fruit, putting their hands on the ladder as they climb down, right? And then repeat, repeat, repeat. This is that type of stuff we thought about when we looked at our workflow for shiitakes, and we specifically spelled out the steps for work to minimize any potential cross-contamination between our tools, our equipment. We do that all the time on our farm, and anyway, it's a good practice. We don't go and trim the sheep hooves and then go harvest mushrooms. We have to change clothes or do them on different days. So really just thinking through, and actually with many farms, I've just helped them list out the steps of, okay, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this. And it's tedious, but it's really helpful. In addition to thinking about food safety, it's often actually helpful to list out tasks from an efficiency standpoint, because you start to think about it in a different way. So that's the first thing. Then we're gonna, of course, do some kind of pre and post harvest assessment of affected areas, some kind of monitoring. And during 1, 2, and 3 on this list, you're gonna go down to 6, document, document, document. Because if there's ever a question, if someone's ever showing up, some establishments in some counties, the health department can show up if there's an incident, even if they don't technically have full jurisdiction. If someone got sick in a restaurant and your ingredient was in their thing, they can come back and check on things. If you don't have any documentation, that's not gonna look very good, right? So we're always thinking about what paper trail we have and how we can just explain, well, this is exactly what happened. That's what they're looking for. And that's probably a good practice anyway, right? We wanna do that. 4 and 5 would be the two main things that we wanna establish as good standards that, again, we don't have a specific guideline on. We have some anecdotes and some examples, but we could think about at least starting somewhere and then testing our hypothesis on a farm. So establish an interval, decide if it's going to be 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 or 120 days between when you're grazing or livestock or in a paddock and when you do your harvest, right? The other option is just to consider a buffer zone and literally just exclude the animals from the area where the crops might come into contact with them, and decide if that's 10 feet or 20 feet or 30 feet, and that's where the fencing goes, right? So those are the kind of the basics, and those apply whether you're up at the highest requirements of standards down to just covering your tail as you think about selling food to the general public, right? As we go. All right, so some pretty pictures now that we've talked about all this fun stuff with food safety. All right, so here's what we came up with the shiitakes. What we realized over time with the efficiency, the workflow, the management, all the things, we actually don't need them to be in there all the time. We need a much smaller flock in there for very specific targeted. What we want to do is knock back the population. And so what we do is we bring them into the entire mushroom yard in early spring. We make sure it was at least 30 days before the first fruiting of our mushrooms, which is usually sometime in June. And we let them have at it. And they're basically cleaning up the soil. They're keeping the slug population down, and they get full reign of the site. All right. And then what we did for the summer is we set up what we call the duck moat. And that's really just a fancy way to say we're excluding the fruiting mushrooms, which you can see on the left and right of the screen, from where the ducks actually are. And if we had a spike in slug issues, well, then we put the ducks in there around them. And actually it did quite a bit, because if the slugs are on the logs or on the mushrooms, it's too late. It's way too late. We really need to keep the population low, is what we learned over time. And so we really just needed, again, we just grabbed half dozen ducks and we put them into this area if there was a spike in slugs. And that really correlates a lot to the moisture and the rain patterns of the season. So when it's dry, we actually don't really have to worry about this at all. So that's what we learned from that system. And it's a very specific, tailored system that is good, I think, from a food safety standpoint as well as from a management standpoint. I'm going to steal one more example from our friends up the road who have a wonderful little orchard, cider orchard. We actually share a ram. That cutie in the bottom left, KJ, with the horns there in the front. He's our ram, at least for another year, I hope. But just to show some examples of what they do with livestock. They are a tree-centered operation. They use livestock. They have a very small flock of sheep, I think 6 to 12 at most, and the geese range from 5 to 20, and one of the things that Eric told me is he thinks that with just geese, if you had like 25 or 30 geese, you could probably maintain all the mowing the orchard needs. I don't remember how many acres it was. I meant to ask him before this, but throughout the summer without needing any other effort. And what's great about the geese is they do a good job of weeding the grass, but they don't ever attack the trees, right? That's awesome. The sheep, on the other hand, you can see in the spring, they have a buffer. They're excluding the trees. Spring growth on trees is very appealing to those sheep. So he's just excluding them and using them to graze those alleyways, versus in the fall where they have a little more free reign after the harvest, no concerns with food safety, really using them as a way to clean up some of the drops, spread their fertility more evenly throughout the site, maybe trim some of that excess vegetation that's not a fruit tree, right, over time. So that just gives you an example. And what I think is a real key takeaway from any of these things is that each individual grazing system, if we're going to integrate tree crops and livestock, really has to be kind of custom fit to the site. And it's probably not going to look the same throughout the season. It's probably going to be a bit of a pulse of different efforts at different times of the year. And in some cases, it may not be just one type of livestock if you really want to achieve the type of work you want to do. So kind of have to juggle all those rocks to figure things out. So that's the summary of the fun world of the food regulations around silvopasture. I would love questions, but I'd also love if Rich is willing to unmute for a minute and just share and solicit any potential producers for your research if you're interested in doing that. If not, you could just put your contact in the chat for us. But otherwise, yeah, let's see what kind of questions and conversation we want to do here.
Yeah, hi, Steve. I don't know if you can hear me here or if we're all muted.
Nope, I can hear you. Go for it.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me to say a word about that. First of all, I'll keep this brief, but I'd like to say that your overview of the current regulatory situation is exactly spot on. And the project that we at Farm Commons are working on with the Savannah Institute here is to try to figure out, first of all, how are different farmers approaching the flexibility that's allowed under the standards? Is everybody kind of just assessing their own needs and following their own best practices? Or are people saying, I feel more comfortable if I can point to existing rules or regulations and say, I'm following this? Certainly, flexibility is great, but if something bad did happen, ideally you'd want to be able to point to a set of standards and say, you know, I'm at the very least, even ideally, I'm following the regulation, but at the very least, I'm following generally accepted best practices. So what we're trying to do is just talk to farmers who are, you know, integrating livestock in various ways and figure out, is everybody more or less deciding that there's a certain set of practices they want to follow, or are people more likely to be doing things specific to the conditions on their own farms? And then the follow-up question to that is, would you feel more comfortable with a more clearly defined set of regulations that you can point to? Or are you feeling okay with having that flexibility and, as you mentioned, a pretty broad range of openness to interpretation that might vary from region to region or agent to agent? So that's a project we're working on, and we're definitely interested in talking to anybody who's engaged in integrating livestock, especially in the realm of specialty crops, because that's where the national organic standards really come into play. So if you think that's something you'd like to talk to me about, please visit the Farm Commons website. You'll find my contact information there, and I'd be happy to talk more with you. So thank you again for the mention. I think this is a really cool project, and I'm hoping we'll be able to pull together some, at least some good recommendations going forward, and think about if there may be more regulation coming down the pike, what do we want that to look like?
Yeah, that's great. That's a really important point, because we go back to the slide with FSMA. They do have this nice little sentence at the end that says the agency will consider providing guidance on this practice in the future as needed. So it's really important that we as farmers don't just wait for the comment periods and try to push back on things, but actually are proactive. And so I really appreciate the effort you all are doing, because if we have a clear consensus, then next time around, if there is one, we'll be more equipped to work with it. So I think it's great. I'd love if there's any producers out there who do already commingle livestock in a crop to just share a little bit about what that looks like on their farm, if anyone's willing to do that. So I'll encourage that. And you can unmute yourself, or if you're on a phone, you can do, I think *6 will unmute you.
Don't be shy now.
Couple comments I'll mention in the chat, and you're also welcome to chime in on the chat. That's more comfortable. But Nikki's mentioning one issue facing in California is while orchards might be exempt, most packing houses still require adherence to strict food safety regulations. And so that's back to the point of what, depending on where your markets, your produce is going down that supply chain, if they're requiring it. Like I know a friend of mine who sells to the school system, and so GAP certification is absolutely mandatory from that market's perspective. So just because the government isn't saying you need to do this doesn't mean you're not beholden if that's your market. And then Rich, there's just a question of if there's a limit to the geographic scope of your research. I don't know if you want to answer that verbally or on the chat.
Yeah, the short answer is we are kind of trying to focus on Wisconsin farms, but we've got a little bit of wiggle room with that. So even if it's not really a formal participation in the project, at the very least, we'd like to hear people's stories. We'd like to hear about what they're doing.
Question, excuse me, question in the chat from Megan about documentation. Do you keep it in this spreadsheet? We have for us personally, and again, our grazing system, our sheep don't have any interaction with tree crops, so it's really just the only ones we sell are the mushrooms. And we just actually moved our mushroom operation to a new spot in the woods, and so it's amazing because it's almost completely slug free this year, but that's probably because of the drought. So we have to update our system. But what we have for the farm, we have kind of like a playbook, which is like lists the procedures and practices for different systems on the farm. And then really what we do is for the ducks is pretty minimal. I think it'd be way different on orchard, but just to give you an example, in a spreadsheet, we do mark the dates of, in our grazing, it's essentially our grazing plan is the spreadsheet, right? So we're just marking time of entry and time of leaving, and we treat the mushroom yard as one of the paddocks, so it has a number, and so we just have that quick reference to when somebody went around the mushrooms or not. And all the mushrooms have a lot number associated with them, and so we can also in our harvest log mention if they're there, but mostly it just shows up in the grazing plan at the end.
Here's a quick question. What livestock species will eat apples on the ground, sheep and other livestock?
Yeah, I don't know if others in the group here have thoughts. I certainly have fed apples to sheep and cows that I've managed, and they enjoy them as a snack. I don't know if they'd be your best tool for like cleaning up an orchard because they tend to like fresher ones and things like that. I think the traditional species and what people often think are running pigs through. And certainly poultry, you could get a bit of the help in breaking down, fruit that's fallen to the ground, and breaking some of the potential pest cycles there. But so I think there's potential for a lot of different things. It just depends on how clean you want things to be, I guess.
You did a great job explaining all this, Steve. There's not very many questions, so you must have covered it all, which is great.
Well, that is good to hear. We'll see. I appreciate everyone's attention. I think if you are in the Northeast, just to mention like resources, if you're looking for support around this, the cooperative extension, depending on where you are, can be helpful. Some of the organizations that we mentioned throughout the talk can be really helpful to contact about these things. I know Savannah Institute's doing a lot with Silvopasture. I don't know if you all have anything specifically on the food safety front that you want to mention. And our small farm program also can help point some folks in those things. But just I think the bottom line is really what's important is to develop a plan, document a plan, and have that available. And we don't have a lot of cases, at least in the Northeast, I don't know if other folks have this, of someone getting sort of busted. Again, it's more about having the systems in place. We have seen some FSMA inspections happen on farms in New York State. I can speak mostly to New York State. But they're generally scheduled and cordial, and often I feel like with farmers we get this sort of like fear around it, and I don't think that's the experience of a lot of folks. I think again mostly what we're trying to do is cover our tracks and understand, and I really like how Richard framed the question of like, to what degree do we want a specific guideline, or do we want sort of a guidepost? And so we don't really know.
Yeah, and for Savannah Institute, I know we will be having that information coming out, but the project is still happening. So I think we've done a past webinar with Eliza Greenman about it, and then we'll be talking about it in some future webinars, but stay tuned for the rest of the information. And then Megan has a question. What does your elderberry extract process look like in terms of regulations?
It's a great question. yeah, I mentioned on the first slide we do elderberry extract, still on a pretty small scale, and actually mostly for personal and family consumption. We don't sell it yet, and part of that's because you fall into another layer of regulations for us, which is the sort of value-added products piece, and there's sort of a complicated little tunnel of, is elderberry extract a juice? Is it a medicinal product? Is it neither of those? And so we're both scaling up and waiting for the answer on that piece. And so we've mostly we've shared it and proposed it mostly as an extract. Medicinal extracts are highly unregulated, for better or worse, but juice is highly regulated, and you're beholden to some of the same high-level standards as like a massive juice packer, if you call it a juice. So it's a weird field, and we're not quite there in terms of a sellable product yet for us. And no, not extracted alcohol. It's really just steam extraction of the juice, separating it from the berries, and then we add lemon to raise the acidity. So it's a high acid food. So our early indications are that it's a pretty benign product from New York's perspective. New York is particularly fun when it comes to food regulations, and I wish I lived in a different state because it's overly cumbersome for small producers. There's no exemption for any sort of scale or anything like that. And it's interesting, as far as a grazing crop goes, elderberry has the toxicity in the leaves, and we haven't really ever had an issue with sheep and interacting with the elderberry. And so they kind of commingle with it, and it does just fine. And we just exclude them before harvest.
Would you recommend that people go, I know when I was doing small vegetables in Minnesota, we would go through GAP certification. We didn't need FSMA certification, but GAP's just kind of for fun and to get ourselves set up. Would you recommend that people do that?
Yeah, I think, especially my work with mushroom production, the standards that are provided are just like really good ideas, and they give you that framework to set up tracking systems. And it's so much easier to do that from the beginning when you're just producing a small amount than when you've already scaled up and kind of become entrenched. So I think for beginning producers, it's a really good idea to just start off. We kind of went backwards and are doing that, even though we didn't have to. So again, GAPS provides, I think, mostly common sense things about hygiene and procedures and checklists and documentation and tracking, traceability. So I would recommend that, and doing it sooner than later, like you're kind of implying with the vegetables. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, if there are are there any last minute questions before we kind of thanks and sign off? I'm just like waiting for somebody to furiously type something.
That's all right. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is wonderful and great. And I was especially excited to hear about the ducks and the slugs, because people are always like, oh, they're great pest control, but they never really talk about the food safety issues with that. So that was really enlightening, at least for me.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, well, have a wonderful evening, everyone. Again, this will be posted on our Facebook page and our YouTube starting on Thursday. So yeah, thank you. Have a great night.